While the whole world was watching destroyers move through a 21-mile corridor, while cameras were pointed at naval standoffs and politicians were arguing about blockades and diplomats were flying home from Islamabad with nothing in their hands, Saudi Arabia did something that almost nobody noticed. Something quiet. Something that had been 45 years in the making. On April 12, 2026, Saudi Arabia changed the entire power equation of the greatest energy crisis the modern world has ever faced. Not a weapon, not a threat, not a navy. A pipeline. And the story of that pipeline, how it was built, why it was built, what Iran did to try to stop it, and how Saudi Arabia repaired it within days, is one of the most extraordinary strategic moves in the history of global energy. While everyone else was watching the front door, Saudi Arabia was building a back door 45 years ago and just walked through it. Because the real story of who is winning and losing the Hormuz crisis is not happening in the Strait. It is happening underneath the Arabian desert. To understand what Saudi Arabia just did, you have to start with what Iran did first. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes on Iran. Within hours, before the smoke had even settled, Iran reached for the one lever it knew would cause maximum pain to the entire planet. It moved to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The numbers of what followed are staggering. The Strait of Hormuz normally carries approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day, roughly one-fifth of everything the entire world consumes. Under normal conditions, approximately 150 ships pass through those 21 miles every single day. When Iran moved, that number collapsed to 4 or 5 vessels per day, a 97% reduction in traffic, essentially overnight. The world felt it immediately and everywhere. Oil prices shot toward $120 a barrel. Gas prices at American pumps climbed past $4. Factory input costs across Asia surged. European energy bills spiked. Countries that had built their entire economic models around the reliable daily flow of Gulf crude began making contingency calculations they hoped they would never have to make. Iran had played its trump card, and on the surface, it was devastating. On the surface, because Saudi Arabia had already planned for exactly this moment. Not this specific war, not this specific day, but this specific scenario. The closure of Hormuz had been sitting on Saudi Arabia's planning horizon for decades. And Saudi Arabia, in the quiet, methodical way that has made it the world's most consequential oil producer for half a century, had already built the answer. Go back to the early 1980s. The Iran-Iraq War is raging. Tankers in the Persian Gulf are being attacked. The Strait of Hormuz is threatened. And somewhere in Riyadh, Saudi decision-makers looked at the geography of their situation and understood something important. Saudi Arabia sits on the largest conventional oil reserves on Earth. Its oil fields are in the eastern province, pressed against the Persian Gulf. Every barrel it sells to the world passes through 21 miles of water that someone else could, under the right circumstances, threaten. That was unacceptable. So Saudi Arabia built a way around it. The East-West Pipeline, also known as the Petroline, is 200 kilometers of steel pipe crossing the entire Arabian Peninsula. It starts at the Abqaiq oil field in the eastern province, where Saudi Arabia's legendary reserves sit beneath the desert floor. It runs westward across the full width of the country and ends at the Red Sea port of Yanbu on Saudi Arabia's west coast. 200 kilometers, crossing an entire country, completely bypassing the Persian Gulf, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Completely beyond the reach of any Iranian patrol boat, any Iranian mine, any Iranian drone, any Iranian missile that could threaten tankers in the Gulf. It was built during the Iran-Iraq War specifically as a contingency, a hedge against the scenario that is now playing out, a way to keep Saudi oil flowing to the world even if someone managed to close the door at Hormuz, and it has been maintained quietly for 4 decades, waiting. On February 28, 2026, the moment the strikes on Iran began and Hormuz began closing, Saudi Arabia activated it. Within hours of the first missiles landing, Saudi Arabia's operational teams turned the taps on the Petroline and began moving crude oil westward across the desert toward the Red Sea. But here is where the story goes from impressive to extraordinary. The pipeline as originally built had a capacity of 5 million barrels per day. That is significant, but 5 million barrels against the 20 million that normally flow through Hormuz is only a 25% offset. Important, but nowhere near enough to replace what was being lost. Saudi Arabia had already solved this problem too. In 2026, Aramco converted a set of parallel pipelines that had originally been built to carry natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane, the feedstocks for Saudi Arabia's petrochemical industry, and repurposed them to carry crude oil. This conversion had been in planning since 2019, following the drone strikes on Abqaiq that year, but was not activated at full scale until the crisis made it necessary. The conversion added 2 million barrels per day of additional capacity to the bypass route. Suddenly, the Petroline was not a 5 million barrel pipeline, it was a 7 million barrel pipeline. 7 million barrels of Saudi crude per day flowing westward across the desert to the Red Sea with absolutely no connection to the waterway Iran had just closed. On March 11, 2026, just 11 days after the war began, Saudi Arabia completed the conversion to full capacity. 11 days from crisis to full activation of the most important piece of energy infrastructure on the planet. By late March, crude exports through the port of Yanbu had reached approximately 5 million barrels per day, with an additional 700,000 to 900,000 barrels of refined products moving alongside them. A senior Gulf energy executive watching all of this unfold summed up the situation with a single sentence. He said that in hindsight, the East-West pipeline looks like a genius masterstroke. 45 years of preparation, 11 days to activate. Iran spent weeks engineering the closure of Hormuz, and Saudi Arabia spent 45 years engineering a way around it. Iran was watching, and Iran understood precisely what Saudi Arabia was doing. Every barrel flowing westward through the Petroline was a barrel that did not need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Every barrel that left Yanbu was a barrel that weakened the leverage Iran had spent weeks fighting to establish. The entire strategic logic of Iran's Hormuz gambit, create economic pain severe enough to force concessions, was being systematically undermined by a pipeline running under the Arabian desert. Iran could not allow this to continue. Before we get into what Iran did next and how Saudi Arabia responded in a way that almost no one expected, if this story is changing how you see this crisis, drop a comment right now. Tell us, did you know this pipeline existed before today? And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because what comes next in this breakdown is the part that the financial press buried on page 6. Shortly after the ceasefire between the United States and Iran was declared on April 9th, Iran launched strikes targeting multiple energy-related sites across Saudi Arabia. The attacks hit oil, gas, refining, and electricity infrastructure across Riyadh, the eastern province, and Yanbu industrial city. One of the strikes damaged one of the Petroline's 11 pumping stations, 700,000 barrels per day. Gone. One strike on one facility, and a significant slice of Saudi Arabia's bypass capacity disappeared. Iran was sending a message as clear as any radio broadcast. We see what you are doing. We understand what it costs us, and we will not let you do it without consequence. It was on tactical terms a meaningful blow. A pumping station on a major pipeline, struck precisely because Iran had identified it as the mechanism neutralizing its greatest strategic weapon. For most countries, that strike would have meant weeks or months of disruption. For Saudi Arabia, it meant something different. On April 12, 2026, the same day Trump announced the blockade, the same day the Islamabad peace talks formally collapsed, the same day oil surged above $100 a barrel, Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Energy issued a confirmation that almost nobody was paying attention to. Full pumping capacity on the East-West pipeline had been restored to approximately 7 million barrels per day. They fixed it within days. Iran attacked one of the most critical pieces of energy infrastructure on Earth, and Saudi Arabia restored full capacity before the week was out. This did not happen by accident. Saudi Arabia had pre-positioned spare parts. It had engineering teams on standby, trained specifically for exactly this scenario. It had rehearsed emergency restoration protocols that allowed it to respond not with weeks of repair work, but with days. Saudi Aramco has decades of experience maintaining infrastructure under threat. The speed of this restoration was the product of preparation, not luck. Now let us put the 7 million barrel number in its full context. Before the war, the Strait of Hormuz carried approximately 20 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's pipeline at 7 million barrels covers approximately 35% of that total. Better than 5 million, but still leaving a significant gap. Saudi Arabia is not alone in contributing bypass capacity. The UAE has its own pipeline, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, that allows crude exports to bypass the strait through the port of Fujairah on the UAE's eastern coast. This pipeline can handle up to approximately 1.8 million barrels per day at maximum utilization. Add Saudi Arabia's 7 million and the UAE's 1.8 million together, and you approach 9 million barrels per day of bypass capacity on the crude oil side. That is still less than half of what Hormuz normally carries. And for countries like Kuwait and Iraq, who have no comparable bypass infrastructure whatsoever, the gap is total. Kuwait exports approximately 2.5 million barrels per day. Every single barrel passes through Hormuz. There is no Kuwait pipeline running to the Red Sea. Iraq faces the same problem. The proposed Basra-Aqaba pipeline has been in planning stages for over a decade. It has never been built. There is also the port problem, and this is the constraint that is now binding more tightly than the pipeline capacity itself. Yanbu was never designed to be the primary oil export terminal for the world's largest crude producer operating under wartime emergency conditions. In March 2026, Yanbu handled 47 VLCC loadings, very large crude carriers, the supertankers that move the world's oil in 2 million barrel increments. That is 4 times its pre-war monthly average of 11 to 12. The result is a bottleneck. The pipeline can push 7 million barrels per day westward across the desert. The port can only load approximately 4.4 million barrels per day onto ships in the current operational environment. Fleets of supertankers are queuing off the Red Sea coast, waiting their turn in lines that stretch for miles across open water. Saudi Arabia knows this is the binding constraint, and Saudi Arabia is already working on solving it. The Ministry of Energy is actively examining whether to expand the East-West pipeline's capacity further beyond 7 million barrels per day. New export terminals along the Red Sea coast are under discussion, including at the site of the Neom mega project, the futuristic city on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast that was supposed to be about tourism and technology and smart living. It is now being considered as an emergency oil export terminal. Beyond the immediate fixes, the larger vision is taking shape. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, a U.S.-backed framework first announced at the G20 summit in New Delhi in September 2023, has gained an urgency in 2026 that no diplomatic announcement could have given it. The corridor would link India to Europe through an integrated network of ports, rail lines, and pipelines spanning the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Oil from the Persian Gulf, piped across Saudi Arabia, shipped across the Red Sea, routed through Jordan, connected to Israeli Mediterranean ports, and pushed into European markets, all without touching a single Iranian-controlled waterway. One senior advisor at the Atlantic Council told the Financial Times that he was sensing a shift from hypotheticals into operational reality. That is the most important sentence in global energy policy right now. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu voiced his support directly. He said long-term solutions include rerouting energy pipelines westward across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea and Mediterranean, bypassing Iran's geographic choke point, and emphasized that infrastructure solutions are more sustainable than military options. Infrastructure over military. That is a striking statement from a country conducting one of the most intense air campaigns in recent Middle Eastern history. The logic is undeniable. You can send destroyers through the strait. You can clear mines, you can impose blockades, but as long as Iran sits on the northern shore of those 21 miles, the threat never fully disappears. The only permanent answer is to make the strait less necessary, to build around it, to create alternatives so robust that closing Hormuz stops being a weapon and becomes merely an inconvenience. Replicating the East-West pipeline from scratch would cost at least $5 billion. Multi-country corridors like the India-Middle East-Europe link could exceed $20 billion. $20 billion to permanently sever the global energy system's dependence on a 21-mile choke point. $20 billion to make the question of who controls Hormuz irrelevant. But honesty requires acknowledging what 7 million barrels per day does not solve. Liquefied natural gas is different from crude oil. It cannot be piped in its liquid form across a desert and loaded onto regular tankers. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the largest LNG complex on the planet, supplies 12 to 14% of Europe's LNG and enormous quantities to Asia. Iranian strikes destroyed 2 of its processing trains in the early weeks of the conflict. Recovery to full capacity is not expected before the end of August. There is no LNG equivalent of the Petroline. There is also the Bab el-Mandeb to consider. Every barrel that flows through the Petroline from the eastern province to Yanbu still needs to be loaded onto a ship and sailed south through the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and out to global markets. That means every Saudi barrel exported through the bypass route must pass through the Bab el-Mandeb, the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. The Petroline solves the Hormuz problem. It creates a new Bab el-Mandeb problem. Iran controls the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis have already demonstrated the capability and willingness to attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea. If Iran activates that proxy force in response to the Hormuz bypass, Saudi Arabia's back door runs directly into another choke point that Iran has the means to threaten. The bypass transfers risk rather than eliminating it entirely. And there is one more cost that Saudi Arabia is paying that deserves to be acknowledged. The natural gas liquids pipelines converted to carry crude oil were originally built to supply feedstock to Saudi Arabia's petrochemical industry. Ethane, propane, and butane flowing to SABIC's Yanbu operations. Those feedstocks are now being diverted to carry crude instead. Saudi Arabia is cannibalizing its long-term economic diversification strategy to manage the immediate crisis. The kingdom built Vision 2030 partly to reduce its dependence on oil revenue. The Hormuz crisis is forcing it to maximize that very dependence in the short term. It is a real trade-off made with open eyes, because the immediate stakes are more important than the long-term plan, but it is a trade-off nonetheless. Even if Hormuz were to fully reopen tomorrow, the shipping industry would not immediately return. Tanker captains and shipping executives do not sail back into a contested waterway the moment someone announces it is safe. Not after mines were laid there. Experts say it would likely take until July, 3 months from now, even in the best-case scenario, for oil flows through Hormuz to return to normal volumes. 3 months of the East-West pipeline carrying the weight of the global energy system on its 200 kilometers of steel shoulders. 3 months of Yanbu loading supertankers at 4 times its normal rate. 3 months of the world depending more completely than at any point in its history on a single pipeline crossing a desert country that Iran has already demonstrated it knows how to strike. The concentration of risk is real. The achievement is extraordinary. Both things are true simultaneously. But the full picture of Saudi Arabia's response is not just a pipeline. It is a constellation of moves happening simultaneously on multiple levels. Pakistan is leading a foreign nation coalition, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, pushing for a negotiated resolution. Trump has publicly credited that coalition for maintaining enough ceasefire pressure to keep the conflict from reaching its worst possible escalation. Saudi Arabia is part of the architecture trying to make peace possible while simultaneously operating the infrastructure, keeping the global economy functional during the crisis. Here is the full picture of what Saudi Arabia just did. Not one thing, Not a single impressive move. A constellation of decisions stretching across 4 decades. A pipeline built during the Iran-Iraq War as a hedge against exactly the scenario that just played out. An engineering conversion completed in under 2 weeks, expanding capacity from 5 million to 7 million barrels per day. A port operation pushed to 4 times its pre-war loading rate. A rapid repair operation that restored full pipeline capacity within days of an Iranian strike that most countries would have taken months to fix. Active planning for new terminals, new pipeline expansions, and multi-country corridors that could permanently reduce global dependence on Hormuz, and a seat at the diplomatic table pushing for the peace that makes all of the engineering moot. The United States sent destroyers through the strait and called it a blockade. Iran issued final warnings and launched drones at pumping stations. But Saudi Arabia built a way around the whole problem before most of the people currently arguing about it were born, maintained it through 4 decades of relative peace, activated it within hours of war breaking out, repaired it within days of being struck, and is now planning to make it permanent. That is not the move of a country caught off guard by a crisis. That is the move of a country that understood, longer and more clearly than almost anyone, that the Strait of Hormuz was always a vulnerability, and that the only real power in this equation comes not from who controls the choke point, but from who no longer needs it. While the world watched the front door, Saudi Arabia was already walking through the back. Subscribe to Signal Drop so you do not miss what comes next. This story is moving fast, and we will be here covering every development as it unfolds. And tell us in the comments, did you know the Petroline existed before this video? And do you think Saudi Arabia's backdoor is enough to prevent a full global energy collapse if Hormuz stays closed past April 22? On April 12th, the day markets panicked, the day diplomacy failed, and the day oil crossed $100 again, the most consequential move in the global energy crisis was made not in Washington, not in Tehran, and not in the Strait itself. It was made in the Saudi Ministry of Energy, with a 4-line press release confirming that a pipeline built 45 years ago was running at full capacity again. That is the sentence that changed the equation, and almost no one read it.